This is a webinar and a Q&A on the topic of healing the divide between God and sex. Now, if you're not familiar with this idea, if you haven't really experienced this divide poignantly in your life, I want to share just a couple of stories of people who, like me, experienced this moment in time when we felt as if we were going to have to choose between deeper intimacy with God and learning about or expressing some aspect of our sexuality. Now, the Bible has a lot of things to say about our sexuality, how to express that in a way that aligns with our identity as children of God. The Old Testament also includes a lot of instructions related to sex. Many of these instructions are related to menstrual blood, actually, as well as to the release of other bodily fluids. There was something about these things that made a person unqualified to enter the temple and the presence of God. And then there are about 6 or 7 references to something that has been translated in our Bibles as homosexuality. And there is deeper, more intricate meaning to these words than how we even understand sexual identity, sexual attraction today. But for those people who have ever been divorced, for those people who have ever experienced some form of intimacy without being married, for those who have been married with questions about what kind of intimacy is acceptable, at some point, a lot of people ended up crossing a line and going in a direction they felt was opposite of where God was leading them. And I've spoken to so many people that feel like something about their sexual expression makes them ineligible for relationship with God. Maybe that's you, maybe that's not. Maybe your story is more like mine, where your experience of sexuality was one of really ignorance and not understanding because you believed that learning anything about sex was going to take you in a direction of irresistible temptation, would lead you down a path away from your connection with God. And I said, I want my connection with God so much that I'm willing to give up everything to do with sex in order to have it. And the deeper I studied and the further I went in my relationship with God, the more I discovered that maybe it's possible this divide that both groups of people have experienced is not necessary. Maybe this divide comes from our misunderstanding of something. And maybe there is a way for these two things to come back together. So we're going to get into that a little bit tonight, but first I want to say hello to everyone and welcome you all in, give you a couple of details for tonight. This Zoom call is being recorded. And if you would like anonymity, you're welcome to rename yourself, to stay off camera, and to participate in chat. I'll be reviewing this video later. I may share some clips of me speaking. And I want to be sure that you feel safe to participate in whatever way you're comfortable with. So if you're open to come on camera, join me speaking, you're more than welcome to do that. And if you just want to leave some comments or simply view the conversation, you are welcome to whatever level of participation you feel is right for you tonight. But thank you for being here. For a lot of people, the choice to actually learn about their sexuality and its connection with God goes so much against the two mainstream ways of thinking about sex in our culture. Because the one sexual ethic that we have says don't do it unless you meet these 4 or 5 different criteria. Like you have to be heterosexual, you have to be married, and if you're truly biblical, you have to be doing it in order to have kids. And this is going to be a surprise to some people who think, maybe it's only heterosexuality or maybe it's only marriage. But the deeper I've studied, and I'm intrigued by this, and I'm on a rabbit trail, but there is this biblical idea of children that is so important through the Old Testament. And it doesn't get displaced until the New Testament, when the idea of porneia, or sexual morality, this idea of self-control or sexual expressions that reflect one's position as part of the kingdom of God. Until that point, the having of children was the whole point of sex, of marriage. This was like the key thing. And if you didn't have kids, you were terribly ashamed. Kind of like a lot of people are ashamed now, like if they had sex and they weren't married. So how did we get from, you don't have kids, you should be ashamed, to where we are today? It's a little bit of a long story. We'll go into a couple of pieces of that tonight. But there has been such a reaction to this one sexual ethic, because basically what it did is it put people into a place of immaturity, ignorance, and disempowerment, where you're not allowed to know your body. And feel free to drop in the chat if you've experienced this. If you've been in a place where Christian teaching said you are not allowed to learn how your body functions, you are not allowed to understand your desire, don't look at it. In fact, run away from it, because your sexual desire is irresistible and will take you places that you do not want to go. Yeah. See, this is the majority of purity culture teaching. And just another story before I get to the second variation of sexual ethics that has been very unhelpful to our society. And that is, I was part of an AA meeting. It was a Christian variation of AA. It's called Celebrate Recovery. And the very first step of both of these two meetings is to recognize that you are powerless in the face of your desire for something. And while I think this is a helpful starting point when you are struggling with an addiction and your experience of something, whether it's a substance or an experience or another person, is irresistible to you, the reality of it is that you just don't know how to be powerful. This is something that you are going to have to learn and to work on. And you learn that in these programs, which is wonderful. But even years down the road, you still have these people who are like, I am powerless before this thing. They never really got free. And when it comes to sex, that is my goal for you as a follower of Jesus, is to have your relationship with your sexuality, your experience of sexuality, be something that isn't a constant resisting of temptation. I'm not going to go there. I know all the places I don't want to go, and yet I want to go there, and I'm not going to. That's not a state of freedom. A state of freedom is knowing where you want to go, being able to choose that, and to look at all of these other options over here and be like, I don't even want this. Why would I go there? And it's you choosing, not the social shame of having messed up, of violating something, not some fear that you were going to harm your relationship with God, but a desire for an expression of love in your life that is the love of God flowing through you in the way you choose to express your sexuality. That is the goal. That's where I want to get us tonight. But our starting place is here with these two options. I've described one already. It's the don't do it unless option. The other thing that has really entered the church conversation about sexual ethics is the don't judge me conversation. And it basically says, whatever it is that you desire is okay. We're going to love and accept you anyway. And while I appreciate this as a social, relational ethic, we are all welcome before God. I don't think it is very helpful in guiding people toward better decisions and expressing their sexuality in the way that is most aligned with how they're designed. It is possible to experience your sexuality or to express it in ways that are not healthy. And I'll just give one example of this, because it comes up over and over again in conversation, and it sickens me every time I hear it. And that is the heterosexual married couples who believe that God has given them the right to rape their partner. Because we're married, so anything goes. If I want it, you have to give it to me. This is usually men to women. And this was how I thought, raised in purity culture. You don't do it until you're married, and after you're married, she can't say no. Your partner has no agency over their sexuality. It belongs to God, and God gave it to you in the marriage ceremony. So you have it whenever, however you like. And people feel that this is moral because it doesn't violate any one of the three major rules of heterosexuality and marital status and potential for childbirth. Don't judge me, right? We have permission to do all kinds of things. There is a third option, is not really talked about much in Christian circles, and that is the practice of consent makes it okay. And I feel like this is a helpful step in the right direction because it does recognize the individual's sovereignty. It does maintain the high value for relationships in the expression of sexuality. What it doesn't do, though, is resolve the lingering question that is in a lot of people's minds. Is God going to be okay with this? Because you got consent from your partner, so you have this consent with another person. But without clearly understanding a biblical sexual ethic, we're left with this question of, is my behavior somehow leading me away from God? Am I now disqualified from being a Christian? And this is especially the case when we read verses in the New Testament, like those who are sexually immoral and adulterers will not inherit the kingdom of God. What does that mean? And if you're curious, I do unpack a lot of these passages in my YouTube channel. So go check that out, because a lot of these words, when they come in, are referring to something specific. And in fact, the word porneia can be referring directly to what we talked about taking place within these marriages where sex is happening non-consensually. That'll be a surprise for some people. So we have these two options in the Christian church. You either meet these requirements to do it, or you just don't judge anybody for anything. We're all okay. And neither one of these is honoring the call to grow in sexual maturity and in understanding how our sexuality is integrated with our relationship with God. What does it have to do with our identity as human beings? Because let's actually open up the Bible. And if you don't have one with you, I always recommend the Blue Letter Bible. They do not pay me for this, and nor do they need to. I am very grateful to have resources like theirs to use and to share with you. So I'm going to share the screen. I'm just pulling this up now. And switch to my favorite translation at the moment. I've been toying around with a couple. I have an ESV study Bible that I love, which is why that happens to be my favorite. But let's just go to Genesis chapter 1. And there's a couple things that I want us to take a look at while we're here. The first one is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's a whole lot of stuff in this verse. We're not even going to get into half of it. But what I want you to notice is that God creates heaven and he creates earth. Heaven is not somehow this good thing, and earth is not somehow this bad thing. In fact, what we're going to see throughout the rest of this is God spends a lot of time creating things with the earth and calling them good. Another important thing that I like to recognize here is that heaven and earth are two parts of the same creation. And we're going to see this balance of one thing and another both being part of a single creation. You'll also notice the Spirit of God is present. There's so much movement and energy in here. It's just absolutely beautiful. And God creates light, and then God separates light from darkness. So there's a distinction that is made between the one and the other. Earth is not heaven, and heaven is not earth, yet the two meet somewhere. And we'll find out a little bit more about that here at the end. So in Genesis chapter 1 throughout, you see a lot of this division, and then you see things being filled. For example, the waters bring forth, the earth brings forth. You also have this phrase, to rule over, which is given to the two great lights, the sun and the moon, or what we call them today. They were given a function to rule over something. Then you get down to the creation of the creatures of earth. And the earth brings forth all of these creatures, and they are blessed by God. God says, it is good. Look at that. Even before, I think, which day is this? Evening and morning, the fourth day. This is going to be the fifth day. There are sea creatures, waters, birds. And so you have these creatures that are made, and God blesses them and tells them to do something. To be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas and let birds multiply on the earth. Be fruitful, multiply, fill. There are three things that are given to the creatures to do. It's really quite beautiful. And we understand that the idea of multiplication, these kinds of creatures, in contrast with the trees and the green plants and the vegetation, these creatures multiply through sex. But it's not just multiply. There's this idea of being fruitful. And we'll come upon this idea again throughout the Bible, that fruitfulness, for example, we can contrast something in Jesus' parable where he talks about these I can't remember what plant it is, if it's wheat or corn or whatever, but the grain brings forth, you plant one kernel, you get 30. That's fruitful. Or you get 60, or you get 100-fold. This is how it's described there. And in a farming analogy, you want your crops to be fruitful. You want it to return a lot. You want it to thrive. You want it to produce the whole blessing that it can possibly produce, and to fill. This idea of being full as opposed to empty. And now you can kind of understand what this is talking about. There's fullness, there's presence, there's fruitfulness, there's multiplication, and all of this is wrapped up with sexuality. Now, interesting enough, there's something else that happens here. God says, let us make man in our image. This is mankind. And the word Adam means creature of earth. And as we see here, the creature of earth was created male and female. There is something about this, and there's an interplay between Genesis 1 and 2 that is incredibly complex, and there's all kinds of commentary on it if you ever want to dive into it. However, what we can understand is that when God creates humanity, humanity is created male and female. In chapter 2, we see that God breathes breath, which is air, which is part of what we think of as the heavens, into the earth, or the dust of the ground. And so humanity in chapter 2 becomes this meeting point of heaven and earth. And what God blesses this humanity with is to, same thing as the animals, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Our sexuality, our ability to be fruitful, our ability to thrive, all of this is wrapped up together as part of our identity, which is spoken over us at the very beginning by God. Sexuality is a blessing if we understand what it is, what it has potential to be, and how to experience that in connection with God. I also just want to point out that the dominion, the subduing, this is to go completely into this would be hard. But if you're giving dominion over something, you want that thing to thrive as well, right? And when we think about the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens, if we have dominion over them, what kind of kingdom are we creating for them right now? It's an interesting question. It is our blessing to be able to have dominion over these creatures, which is more than just you're allowed to eat them. And God saw everything that he had made, including the bodies of humanity, including sexuality, both of the animals and of the humans. And behold, it was very good. Now, it's hard to find any Christian teacher who's going to come up now and say, sex is evil or the body is evil. But the way that we talk about something is just as important as what we say. How we say something is often more important than what we say. Just as an example of this, let's say we all like to eat snacks. I don't know about you. I have my favorite snacks, and they're a wonderful part of life. And if I start eating too much, I know I need a full dinner. But if I were to say snacks are a wonderful part of life, and then the only thing I ever talk about after that is how snacks will kill you because a lot of them have dyes in them, a lot of them have artificial ingredients in them. If you eat too many snacks, you're likely to get diabetes, heart disease, you're going to die of cancer. Like, what are you going to think about snacks after that conversation? The only thing you're going to associate it with is death. And if that's the only thing we ever talk about them, is how we can misuse them, how we can have terrible snacks, and nobody ever talks about how they can be wonderful and healthy and a good part of life, and how carrots can be a snack, this kind of thing, you're going to end up with the same idea that a lot of Christians have about sex. We say God created sex. Here's a way to sin with it. Here's another way to sin with it. Here's a way to use it that's harmful. Here's a way to do it wrong. And the only thing we know about sex, I don't even know how to express the way I feel, but everybody who I talk to and ask this question too, the only thing they can tell me about sexual morality is a list of things they're not supposed to do. There's not any idea of how it can be healthy, how it can be whole, how it can be integrated into a relationship with God, how it can make a relationship beautiful and rich and reach beyond a biological activity to be something that has deep spiritual meaning, that leads to an incredible relationship with another person. We don't know how to do that because all we're focused on is here's the ways to not do it. So again, you have this whole story here. They're put into the garden to work it and to keep it. And there is something called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And this tree is going to come in to the story again, and it is going to change this last verse. This last verse says, the man and the woman, the way it's translated wife is the same word for woman, were both naked. And this word for naked means more than just lacking clothes. It meant that they were totally open with one another. Every part of them was seen, visible, perhaps known. And the word nakedness is used throughout the Old Testament to describe vulnerability. And a lot of us experience our sexuality as a very vulnerable part of us, partly because of all of the energy that moves through our bodies, partly because of how deeply personal it is to us. But we move from this space of being unashamed to chapter 3, and the indicator that they had eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was this: the eyes of both were opened. Interesting. It'd be fun to explore what it meant for their eyes to be closed before this. And they knew that they were naked. They didn't know before. And what this word know, I think this word to know here, if it's let me just dive into this a little bit. I love the word to know. In Hebrew, it's influenced a lot of my understanding of education. So there's two variations of the word to know. One of them is yada, and the other is da'at. And if you can read this, Yep. So the word to know is an intimate knowing of. They use this as a euphemism for a sexual relationship. Adam knew his wife and she conceived. Interesting how she said she acquired the child was with the help of the Lord. So if you ever want an interesting book to read just about how human understanding of sexuality has developed over the years, there's a book called Sex in History. It's quite big. It's very comprehensive, but it's written by a cookbook author, and so it's very easy to read, quite entertaining actually, and it explores how much people actually understood the mystery of where children came from. Because when you look at the idea of marriage throughout the Old Testament, it was about who the woman belonged to. This is what it all became in the end. But let's wrap back around to chapter 3, lest I go too far down this direction. And they decide to hide from each other, not just from each other, but also from God. We hide our vulnerability from each other and from God. And I just love it that the word they use for this is naked, because a lot of people associate nakedness with sexuality. It's not necessarily the case. Your body. Anyway, I'm not going to go into this. I feel like a college professor sometimes with all of these just singular words and concepts. And I want to stop at each one of them because they're all so deeply meaningful and interesting. But I also want to give you this sort of broad overview of what we're looking at when we're understanding this divide between God and sex. Because here is the first time. Before eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, humanity open, vulnerable, naked with each other, with God. Afterwards, you have this. I heard the sound of you in the garden and I was afraid. Why? Why was I afraid? Because I was exposed. And why was there a problem with being exposed? Has to do with the fruit that they ate. Fruit has to do with the outcome of something. You see, the tree of knowledge of good and evil existed in the garden, and yet before humanity ate from the fruit of it, they didn't experience this shame and this fear around vulnerability, around openness, even here around their sexuality. And what happens because of this? Genesis 3:15 is a very famous verse in theology because this is the first time that a rescuer, a Messiah, is promised. One of the offspring of the woman is going to undo what the serpent did, tempting humanity into this state where they now judge what is right and what is wrong for themselves and live in fear of God. This is the case. Paul says even the people who did not have the law of Moses were a law to themselves. We all have some standard of right and wrong or good and evil that we try to live up to when it comes to sexual ethics or when it comes to our behavior in any part of life, how we see ourselves. If we're not able to live up to the standard we set for ourselves, We want to go hide. We feel shame. We feel fear. And if that's where you are, I really want to welcome you here, because this is the common human experience now. This was how I experienced my sexuality. Anytime I had desire, I was ashamed of myself for being aroused, for being turned on. I didn't know if I was even allowed to enjoy sexual pleasure. And when I did and decided to anyway, and then somebody told me it's sinful, now I'm ashamed of it. Now I'm afraid that this thing that comes naturally to me is going to separate me from God because of what someone said. And that's why I do the work that I do, to unpack the scriptures around sexuality, because people say so many things about it. There are so many things on this, thou shalt not do it unless you meet these certain requirements, that have no biblical basis. Unless you're going to do a surface level reading. And that's all you care about. If you truly seek to understand what the authors are trying to communicate, it's something far different than what you would come to believe if you just asked any Christian person. Every Christian sermon I've heard on this begins with an assumption about what we need to go to the text to look for. Nobody begins with the text and says, what is here? We have our conclusions already written before we come to it. So guess what happens? Something changes with regard to sexuality, with fruitfulness. Multiplication is now painful. It's difficult. There is this shift in relationship where the woman had been created to be the warrior, the strong helper, the wisdom. She would now be subjected. Instead of ruling over the fish and the birds, the man was now going to try to rule over the woman. This is part of the fall that I believe Jesus came to undo. To Adam, cursed is the ground because of you, in pain you will eat of it all the days of your life. What fun. Like, when you read through this, you say, I'm really happy that the Bible is this whole story of here's all the difficulty that we have, right? We're blessed to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And now the earth is rebelling. We're having trouble with being fruitful. Multiplication is painful. We're ashamed of our sexuality. We're ashamed of these gifts that God gave to us. Why? It's because of this tree of knowledge of good and evil. And the outcome of eating from this tree, the fruit of this tree, leads us to death. We find this out in the New Testament as well, because this is the opening chapters of the Old Testament. This leads into the Torah, the teachings of Moses, the law. This is where we get all of the verses of you shall not uncover the nakedness of so-and-so. You shall not have sex with the woman who belongs to your neighbor. You shall not covet, you shall not steal. This is where we get all of these laws. And once we reach the New Testament, we find out that the laws never helped anybody reach life, because humans couldn't keep the law. Even the people of God couldn't keep the law. Having sex disqualified you from going to the tabernacle, right? Experiencing the blessing that humanity is given, which is good, now makes you ineligible to enter the presence of God, which was in the tabernacle. In fact, for a man, if he had an emission of semen, he had to leave the camp. A woman, when she was menstruating, everything that she touched became unclean. She was like a leper, just because of the natural cycle of her body. Do you see how our sexuality is implicated in this whole story so deeply? It is no wonder that when we get now to our present day and we don't have clarity on what God is calling us to in our sexuality, other than it's a list of rules or it's a don't judge me, we're like, okay, so what do we do? How do we experience this in a way that draws us closer to God instead of leading us deeper into shame? And for a lot of us, into suffering and misery. I want to go all the way to the New Testament, and I'm skipping over a lot. So if you decide that you want to go deeper in this, I'm going to open up a phone call tomorrow, actually a Zoom video call. If you want to chat further about any part of this conversation, I invite you to schedule a conversation with me. It's what I'm here for. I'm here to help you understand, help you to unravel some of the things that are holding you back from experiencing intimacy with God, with your body, with your sexuality, with the people that you care about. And this webinar has been almost entirely presentation. I usually like to ask people at some point, and let's just pause for a moment right now. And I'm going to do this with you. I'm going to place my feet on the floor. If you have shoes on, I will invite you to take them off and actually feel your feet against the floor. Because 4,000, 6,000, who knows how many thousands of years after this story is first told, here we are looking at something. And these are words on a screen. There's a face on the screen. We're all here together. But oftentimes, I think we get caught up in our heads where we're like, oh, look at these pictures and words. And we forget that we're in bodies processing all of this. Because as time goes on through the New Testament, through Greek philosophy especially, there comes to be this idea that the mind is more important than the body. We have this phrase, mind over matter. Platonic philosophy, Plato was one of the famous Greek teachers, heavily influenced Catholicism. And he talked about something called perfect spiritual forms in heaven. Remember this divide between heaven and earth, and how they were imperfectly expressed in the material world. So we have inherited today this idea that heaven is out there somewhere, perfect, beyond, disconnected from earth, which is impure, tainted, corrupted. And you have this idea of good is out there and evil is here, or good is what we think about. Good is our spiritual nature. Bad is our body. We don't realize that God created this body and blessed it and called it good. So take a few moments to arrive here in your body. If you can, breathe through your nose and feel the air go all the way down into your belly. Something helpful for this is to place your hand on your stomach and to feel it rise and fall as you breathe. And if you take a minute, just notice your heart beating under your hand. Again, feel your feet on the floor. And I want to ask, do you feel at home in your body? Is this a really uncomfortable experience for you? Now, there's a lot of reasons it may not be comfortable. A lot of our bodies are not healthy. They're not in this state of feeling fruitful and abundant and whole. And not all of that is our fault. Not all of that is something that we can change. But we are not just spiritual creatures. Whatever our relationship is with our body, that is also a key part of who we are. And if you decide to learn with me anymore beyond this, we will spend a lot of time talking about how our sexuality is so much more than just the body. The church over time has talked about sex as if it was a purely biological activity. Sex education in our schools reflects this same idea. We understand sex educators will talk about the brain being the most important sex organ in the body. So we understand our psychology has something to do with it. And we also know that it's wrapped up in relationships. I don't think many of us really understand how. The thing that I cannot find anyone talking about is how sex is connected to spirituality. There is still this fundamental divide between God out here and sex right here. So if you came into this conversation tonight feeling like there is a divide, a separation, and you have no idea how these things can come together, you are not alone. You have inherited, this is the gift of Western civilization. I'm sorry. But it is also something that we can undo. We can learn how to heal this divide. And if you're okay with it, I'm going to take us back into the Bible and we'll take a look at the book of Galatians. And the reason why I'm taking us here is because Galatians brings together a number of concepts that you find throughout the New Testament, specifically in the writings of Paul. And I love to wrestle with Paul's theology. He is an incredibly gifted scholar. It's funny when he's standing before King Agrippa at one point. You can read this in the book of Acts. The king says something like, "Thy learning is driving thee mad." And I'm like, I can totally understand this. It was like, this dude is speaking Greek or something. Now, granted, he probably was speaking Greek, but his level of intellectual development and familiarity with the Mosaic law in the Judaic traditions, as well as his passion for helping people come to understand what they had been called to as followers of Jesus. That just makes his writing so interesting. And he's like me, sometimes trying to say 10 things all at the same time. So if it's ever feeling confusing, it's all right. But I'm here. So if you ever have a question and is confusing, feel free to ask. But Galatians chapter 5 follows chapter 4 logically. And when you're looking at a passage, it's important to understand the context. And a quick peek at chapter 4 tells us that he's talking about sonship, heirs, identity. And then he gets into, at the end of chapter 4, he gets into this example of a contrast between the law and the promise. There's a whole lot in there. But he gets to what we have now labeled chapter 5, and he opens it with this phrase, "For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." And what he's talking about in terms of slavery was the slave woman from chapter 4, in contrast with the person of promise. He's using this as a metaphor for the people who have inherited the law of Moses and live as slaves to the law of Moses. And you'll see here in chapter 5, he also talks about living as a slave to another law. You'll be surprised to find out what that is, perhaps. But you notice here, he's saying, you have been set free from the law of Moses. Everyone who goes back to the law of Moses and says, hey, it was repeated by Paul, therefore we have to keep it, is not understanding what Paul is talking about. You are free. I testify to everyone who accepts circumcision. Now, a lot of us were forced to accept circumcision. This was a ceremonial process of identifying with the Jewish religion. He is obligated now to keep the whole law, the whole of it. You can't pick and choose. If you're going to say we follow this part of the law, you have to follow the rest of it as well. That is the whole Old Covenant. That is the whole Old Testament, what it's about. God comes to the people and says, I will be in relationship with you. Here's what you agree to, and here's what I will do. The people who broke their part of the deal suffered for it. But there was something that went beyond. And this is the story of Jesus, who goes beyond Moses to being a fulfillment of the covenant to Abraham, to fixing something that happened in the days of Noah, which we have no time to get into, and to being that Messiah, that promised seed of the woman that is mentioned all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. This is the Christian message. We believe that Jesus is that Messiah, the one who sets us free from all that was described in chapter 3, all of the problem that came in to our sexuality specifically. And now you've seen how deeply sex is wrapped up in story. Jesus comes to set us free from that, from your husband shall rule over you, from there is going to be pain in fulfilling this multiplication blessing. You are going to struggle and struggle to be fruitful. Jesus says things like, abide in me and you will bear much fruit. It is our connection with God that leads to a restoration of the Garden of Eden, this place where you can be naked and unashamed, open and vulnerable without fear before God and another. This is how you can talk about sex on Facebook. How is it? So what does it look like? Because that's a really cool concept. I'm glad freedom is out there, but I don't feel it in my life. What I feel in my life is this, and we can scroll down a little bit because he's talking about two things. He's talking about people who are slaves to the law of Moses. And then he talks about this. He's like, now here's another issue is a lot of people who find out that they're free, instead of being, remember those two ethical frameworks we have at the beginning, don't do it unless you meet some of these standards that are written down in the law of Moses on one side. On the other side is don't judge me. I do whatever I want and so can you. He says, for you were called to freedom, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. He repeats this again, but I say walk by the Spirit and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Now, when he speaks of the flesh, he is also referring to the law. He's referring to the law of Moses, but he is also referring to the law of instinct. And this will come into play again when he starts describing the works of the flesh. This word, sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, these are all things that we are drawn to by instinct. And now what I'm not saying here is that we are drawn to sin by instinct. What sexual immorality means is allowing natural instinct to govern our sexual behavior. When we are dominated by our desire, that is the understanding of the Greek word porneia, which is translated here as sexual immorality. When you become angry about something, when you disagree with somebody, all of these things, like when you give in to a desire. So when the actions of your life, the works of the flesh, are what you live for, this is how you define yourself. I am this way. I let myself do whatever I feel like. I let myself eat whatever I want. I drink to excess. I have sex to excess. When you get into this idea even of orgies, this is worshiping other gods. This is connected to idolatry. I warned you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. He's not saying those who desire such things. He's not saying having a drink of alcohol is taking you the opposite direction of God. He's talking about being controlled by that thing. I think that is what all of these things have in common, is when we let the law of the body, I feel angry, so I'm going to express anger right now. I feel jealous, so I'm just going to stay here in this jealousy. I'm not going to learn how to deal with it, how to develop something beautiful called compersion, where I rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Strife, this idea of I'm in conflict with you, as opposed to How do I restore this relationship? It's not that we never experienced any of these things. I don't know, maybe showing up at orgies is kind of out there. But this idea that those who make a practice of, this is the word do, and I think they probably have it here. If you make a practice of doing these things, you're going in the opposite direction of the kingdom of God. Why? Because the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. All of these things can be present in the way that you approach your experience of sex. And we keep going, against these things, there is no law. So what I love in this passage is that what Paul does not do is say, if you want to be a good Christian, you have to write down this list of things and never do them. He didn't say that. What he said is that if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law of Moses. And if you walk by the Spirit, which means you do the things, like how you choose to live your life is by these fruits of the Spirit, you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. We have a different thing altogether that we're focusing on. It is beautiful. It is good to study the law of Moses. Psalm 119 talks about just how incredible it is. I love studying the law of Moses. It's incredible, and what it reveals about God is amazing. What we can learn about life is amazing. But if we let that become our ruler, if we are again going to be a slave and be like, I have to remember all 500 things that it says and do them in order to feel like I'm in relationship with God, we're missing the point. If, on the other hand, we're like, well, my body desires this today, and therefore that's who I will be. I define myself by the body. We're defining ourselves either by the law and our ability to keep it, or by the body. And Paul calls both of these things the flesh. And what he says as the alternative is not don't listen to the body, is not don't study the law, not at all. The body teaches us so many things. The law teaches us so many things. But we have been set free from both. We don't have to follow either one of them. There is a danger of doing it, because freedom means you can do whatever you want. If you want to go keep the law and be like, all right, there's these 5 things that 5 criteria I have to meet before I have sex with somebody, great. Or if you want to be like, I can have sex with whoever I want to, great. You are free. You can do any of that. Not that I think either one of them is actually a good idea, because what you are called to is something higher. And I love that the verse is highlighted already. Galatians 5:14. Feel free to read it with me. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You see how these two things are so closely wrapped together? He's saying them back to back again in 13 and 14. Do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. He's saying you could. This is how radical freedom is. This is how incredible what we are called to as Christians is that we could. You can get away with saying, don't judge me. You can get away with setting up a law and following it. But you are called to something higher. You are called to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, there's more I can go into on this, and going into the teachings of Jesus on adultery and how he moves this beyond something that you do with your body to something that you do in your mind and intention. Calling us to have an intention to love one another and also to act upon it. The greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. If you understand that concept, you understand what the whole Old Testament is designed to teach us. If you don't read the Mosaic law through that lens, you're missing the point as a Christian. You might as well be a Jewish person. So how do we do this? We don't do it by trying to find out what are the works of the flesh and avoiding them. We do them by walking in the Spirit, being led by the Spirit, by abiding in our connection with God. And out of this can grow a sexual expression that reflects the fruit of the Spirit instead of the works of the flesh. Or another way this is translated is the works of selfish desire and self-seeking, which is the opposite of love. So let us live by the Spirit. What does this mean? And that is where the second book that I'm working on comes into play. It tells the story of how I came to understand what that meant. And once I came to live in that way, then I started to ask the question. I'm like, okay, so what does this mean for sex? Because I had no clue how it could be connected. Again, my life in the Spirit was out here disembodied. It wasn't part of my practical everyday. I'm actually in a human body this morning. I woke up and here it is again, you know? How do we integrate these things? There's this idea in Hebrews chapter 5. Those who by constant practice can begin to discern good from evil. Practice in what? We can seek understanding. We can seek instruction. If we want to know how to love one another, we have to understand a couple of things. And the biggest thing that stands in our way of loving successfully is our ignorance, about the body, how it functions, about your body, how you experience desire, what activates desire, how does it work, how do you process it in your mind, what role does your mind play in your experience of sexuality, how is this connected to your identity and how you perceive yourself, what are the skills you need to relate, to communicate, to engage with another person, and how. Like, this is still an area that I'm exploring because there is not even a lot of teaching on this, is what is the spiritual dimension of our sexuality? And there's a lot there. So if this is something that you want to begin the journey of, because if we're called to love each other through our sexuality, we have to understand, first of all, what we are working with. Now we can follow instructions. This is what children do. When they don't know, the parent takes them up to the road and says, don't cross the road. This is the amount of instruction that the church provides when it comes to sex. Is like, don't cross the road, it's dangerous. And that works as long as you're a child. But you want to grow up, you want to mature, you want to begin to practice, to be able to understand, to realize the unique way that love can flow through you to someone else who experiences love in a unique way. And what does that have to do with your sexuality? These are some big questions. And tonight, what I hope I've given you is permission to seek understanding, to begin to look for instruction. So this is the idea of pursuing wisdom, seeking wisdom. If you don't know what to do, you can seek instruction from someone who does. Understanding is something that you have to develop on your own. Jesus says, ask and you will receive. This has to do with wisdom. Seek and you will find. This has to do with understanding. Knock and the door will be open to you. This has to do with the way that you live your life. You have to actually try. You have to put forth effort in order to get where you want to go. So if there's anything I can do to support you with that, or if you have any questions just about what we're talking about tonight, I cannot believe a whole hour has passed by. But I want to invite you to book a call with me. Right? I've opened up my calendar the next couple of days because I want to talk. I want to find out what questions you have. I have a book, I have a blog, I'm developing a podcast. These are all resources. And the more I can understand where the difficulties are for you, the better I can tailor this content, the better I'm hoping to create a course. I just had an outline for Christian leaders course this morning that I really want to produce. Because every time I talk with a Christian leader, the only thing they know about sex is the list of things they're not supposed to do. What does it mean to be sexually mature? It's more than not doing one of these things that's on a list. It is, as we discovered, being able to love one another through how we experience and express our sexuality. What does that mean? I don't think any of us have the beginning of a clue about that. It means a whole lot more than get married first. Though get married first is a really good, as we talked about that example of crossing the street, the get married first is a really good safety net. It's a really good way of keeping someone safe. Why? And of course, it doesn't always work, because the goal isn't to stay on this side of the road. The goal is to know how to cross the street safely, to learn through constant practice. How does this heal the divide between God and sex? I think if we understand now what we are called to as Christians, this idea of freedom that we have, this idea of the body as good, of sex as a blessing, that there is a way we can experience and express our sexuality that is aligned with our identity as followers of Jesus, that is part of how we love God and love others, that shifts the whole conversation from don't do this and don't judge me into how can we encourage each other to grow in love and intimacy with God and with each other? How can we grow in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge of sex and sexual desire and sexual skill and personal integrity? I think we have something to pursue, something to go after, something beautiful. And I'm super excited about that. So I want to invite you here at the end of this conversation to connect further with me, however it is that feels right for you, whether it's just on social media, whether you want to. Also, I just launched a Patreon account where I create a couple of opportunities for you to learn more deeply with me. I offer this webinar. It's the same webinar every week because so many people don't have this introduction. We still feel there is this divide, and this is the beginning of bringing them back together. My book takes this to the next level. Go to sacrednotsinful.com if you're interested in learning more about that. The podcast tells stories of people who've been able to integrate their experience of sex and spirituality across a whole spectrum of experiences, expressions, preferences. Some of you will be surprised that that's even possible. Some of you might have a question of why that's important. But I think you know deep down, there's this desire in your heart for sex to be connected to your experience of God, as opposed to feeling like it's something dirty or sinful, full of fear and shame. We want to return to this place that we looked at the very beginning, because I've saved the best for last here. The Garden of Eden. In Hebrew, names have meaning. And the name Eden meant something very special. Because the name of Eden means pleasure. And the garden was planted eastward in Eden, which means the place that God created for humanity to dwell, the place that he created for us to experience life in these human bodies, is eastward, which in that culture symbolized heavenward, toward God, in the land of pleasure and delight. We lose access to that through chapter 3, And I think Jesus opens the way back. I haven't even gotten into that. And I think, oh my goodness, that is one of my favorite parts of the Bible. When the veil of the temple tears in two, and suddenly the way is open to go back into the presence of God. What guarded the way back into Eden was a sword. What was it that tore that curtain? What was it that was waiting, was guarding the way? I don't think it was to keep humanity out. I think it was to keep it open so that one day we could go back in. And that's what I'm here to invite you to do. So thank you for joining me on this webinar. I'm so excited you've been able to watch this. And I want to invite you to connect however feels right. I'll put a couple of options here for you to click on, for you to take advantage of. I really want to talk. I'd love to meet you personally. Feel free to sign up, subscribe, buy anything that you want, or just drop in and say hello. I would love to know what kinds of questions you have, what was raised for you by this presentation, and how it can help you grow. Let's take this journey together. And as I like to say, cheers. I'll see you next time.